Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The Vicarage Garden Party. It was the sort of afternoon St. Aldhelm's prided itself upon. Mild sun tempered by a breeze from the downs, the scent of lilacs mingling with sponge cake and English roses. The vicarage garden, a respectable sweep of neatly clipped lawn bordered by perennial beds, played host to the village's annual spring fete. Tables had been set beneath the yew trees, their white cloths fluttering gently. Tea urns hissed quietly, and elderly ladies from the Mothers' Guild dispensed scones with quiet authority. Children in patent shoes darted through shrubbery under the half-hearted supervision of nannies. The Reverend Charles Alderman, a pleasant man in his early 60s with a fondness for cricket metaphors, was making his usual rounds, offering lukewarm lemonade and well-rehearsed chuckles. At his side, his wife Judith, tall and willowy with an unfortunate taste in mauve cardigans, presided over the raffle table, where a bottle of elderflower cordial and a porcelain shepherdess stood as first and second prizes, and seated beneath the wide bloom of a laburnum tree, clad in dove-grey and peering over her knitting needles, sat Miss Jane Marple. She did not much care for raffles, having long since realized that the law of chance did not often smile upon the truly deserving. Instead, she observed, that was her great strength. Others chatted. Miss Marple listened. She watched as Miss Edna Blake, the vicar's new maid, nervously refilled cups with clumsy haste. Poor girl, clearly unused to silver trays or bone china, and likely more at home with plain crockery and thick teapots. She was perhaps 17, with flyaway hair and a fretful mouth. Not far from her, Mr. Timothy Rowntree, the pharmacist, was engaged in a heated whisper with Mrs. Havers, whose reputation for accidental overdoses had become a source of grim humor among the more daring bridge tables. Young Miriam Cook, the organist, was fluttering around Reverend Alderman like a moth to a cassock, while her widowed mother, Mrs. Clarissa Cook, eyed the tea cakes with suspicion, convinced the vicar's wife had substituted margarine for butter again. Miss Marple sipped her tea and observed the ancient game of village politics unfolding. It was familiar, deliciously so, and yet there was something slightly askew. It was not until the music began, a trio of schoolgirls attempting a hymn on violin, cello, and recorder, that the first real note of disturbance entered the scene. Anyone seen the vicar's prayer book? Judith Alderman's voice rang out, polite but urgent, from the back table. He left it on the lectern after matins, and now it simply vanished. There was a pause, a ripple of disinterest, but not from Miss Marple. Her needles paused mid-loop. The vicar's prayer book was not a trivial object. It was a thick, leather-bound tome, gifted by the Bishop of Gloucester himself. Embossed, signed, and marked with personal annotations, it was used only for Sunday services and special blessings. No child would mistake it for a school reader. No parishioner would move it without permission. It was definitely here this morning, Judith continued, glancing at her husband. The Reverend cleared his throat. Indeed, I remember placing it on the lectern after the second hymn. I saw it there too, chimed in Major Denholm, retired cavalry and stalwart of the parish council. Tidy-looking thing, burgundy binding, gilded edges. Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Havers's teacup clinked against its saucer. Miss Blake had dropped her napkin, and Clarissa Cook pursed her lips sharply, in that way she always did when a family scandal hovered on the breeze. Well, said Judith, with forced brightness, perhaps one of the children mistook it for a storybook. Edna dear, do check the shrubbery, would you? The maid scampered off toward the hedges, clearly relieved to escape the scrutiny. Do you suppose, murmured Miss Marple quietly to no one in particular, that it's gone missing on purpose. Mrs. Weatherby, seated beside her, gave a start. On purpose? My dear Jane, who would want an old prayer book? Miss Marple smiled mildly. Well, it's a curious thing, isn't it? Most thefts are of things one might sell. Silver, money, jewelry. But a personalized prayer book. She let the thought trail off, knowing full well how such phrases tended to root themselves in the ears of women like Mrs. Weatherby, who would by nightfall have repeated the question to at least 5 different neighbors, each time with growing concern. By the time the sun dipped behind the west lawn and the raffle was drawn, the porcelain shepherdess going to her evident horror to young Miriam Cook, the matter of the missing prayer book had grown from a simple mishap to a topic of real speculation. It's not just missing, said the Reverend, now visibly troubled, as he spoke to a small knot of concerned guests. There's no sign of it anywhere, not in the vestry nor the study. Someone must have taken it, or, said Miss Marple gently as she approached, someone wanted it to appear taken. Judith turned toward her, frowning. But Jane, whatever for? Now that, said Miss Marple, her eyes glinting ever so slightly, is the question worth asking. She looked across the lawn, where guests were beginning to drift toward the gates, and paused as her gaze landed on the young maid, Edna Blake, standing awkwardly near the rhododendrons, her eyes wide, her hands clenched. She knows something, Miss Marple murmured. Watson might have written it differently, but St. Mary Mead had its own version of the game afoot, and Miss Marple, needles stilled, knew the game had just begun. Chapter 2. The village reacts by the following morning. The news of the missing prayer book had reached every lace-curtained window and stone doorstep in St. Aldhelm's. As was customary, the facts had grown in inverse proportion to the distance from the actual scene. By noon, it was no longer simply missing. It had been pinched, snatched in full daylight, or spirited away by a stranger in a grey mackintosh. At the High Street grocer's, Mrs. Peg Riley, who claimed to have a nose for wrongdoings, was adamant that the prayer book had been taken by a group of traveling folk she'd seen the previous week, loitering with intent near the War Memorial. In the post office queue, Mr. Elkin, the retired railway clerk, confided in a hushed tone that the loss of the prayer book would surely lead to a curse upon the vicarage. Miss Marple, meanwhile, spent her morning quite productively. She had taken her usual place at the window of her small cottage, ostensibly darning a rather battered pair of socks for her gardener's boy, but in reality observing the foot traffic along Church Lane. And just as she expected, it wasn't. Long before the first ripple of uneasy activity passed by her gate. Miss Edna Blake, maid at the vicarage and reluctant participant in the previous day's fete, hurried past the gate around 11:15, her coat on inside out and her arms wrapped tightly around her midsection despite the warmth of the spring morning. She paused only once, glancing behind her with visible nervousness before continuing toward the village green. Poor girl, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Far too young to be so frightened of something so small, or perhaps something very large indeed. The kettle sang just as a knock came at the door. Miss Marple opened it to find Mrs. Weatherby, wrapped in her usual scent of lavender and slightly alarming camphor, clutching a handbag as though she expected it to be stolen at any moment. "Jane, have you heard?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Do come in, Lavinia. You'll find the kettle has taken the liberty of boiling itself." Mrs. Weatherby seated herself with a sigh and accepted a teacup as if it were a medal for wartime service. "I've just come from Judith Alderman, dreadfully upset. They've searched every inch of the church, even the flower cupboard. Can you imagine, dust on her good gloves? And still no sign of the prayer book? None whatsoever. Though Miriam Cook claims she saw a figure lurking near the vicar's study window the night before the garden party. Black coat. Could have been a cat, of course." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And has anyone spoken to Edna?" "Mrs. Weatherby." sniffed. That girl. She's barely capable of boiling an egg, let alone plotting a theft. Though, she lowered her voice, she is from Stoke-on-Trent. Miss Marple nodded solemnly, as though the geography itself were enough to warrant suspicion. She seemed awfully pale yesterday, Miss Marple mused aloud. One doesn't often see that kind of blanch in a young person without some sort of trauma or guilt. Mrs. Weatherby looked thrilled. Do you think she did it? I think, Miss Marple replied, that she saw something, or someone, and that she's far too frightened to say. By mid-afternoon, several theories had taken root. Major Denholm was certain that this was the work of a radical clerical dissenter, though he could not recall whether such a person existed in the region. Mrs. Clarissa Cook, meanwhile, was convinced that Miriam had done it, out of jealousy, presumably, though of what remained unclear. She had even gone so far as to write an unsigned note to Judith Alderman suggesting the young organist be kept away from sacred objects for the foreseeable future. And at the corner shop, Mr. Rowntree, the pharmacist, speculated that perhaps the prayer book had been hidden by the vicar himself after some sort of private breakdown. The stress of pastoral care, he muttered darkly to the butcher's wife, can have strange effects on a man. By the time twilight settled over St. Aldhelm's, the vicarage had become a place of wary glances and stiff conversation. Judith Alderman, with her accustomed resolve, served stew and dumplings to her husband and their remaining houseguest, none other than Miss Marple. It's quite impossible, Judith sighed as she set the tray down. It's as though the thing vanished into thin air. And poor Charles is inconsolable. The Reverend, seated by the fire, offered a wan smile. It was a gift from the bishop, he said. But it's not just sentiment, Jane. I had written notes in it. Marginalia. Things meant only for my own reflection. Were any of those notes about parishioners? Miss Marple asked gently. Judith stiffened slightly. Well, yes. But nothing salacious, if that's what you're implying. Miss Marple smiled. Oh no, not at all. But even the most innocent reflection, when taken out of context, can appear compromising. Charles looked up. Do you believe someone took it deliberately, Miss Marple? I believe someone wanted it gone, she replied. And the question now is not just who, but why now? That night, as the vicarage clock chimed 10, Miss Marple retired to the guest room with her knitting and a great deal on her mind. The missing prayer book, she knew, was not a prank, nor was it a common theft. No, it had the feel of something else entirely, of embarrassment being shielded, of knowledge being buried, and Edna, sweet, anxious Edna, had looked as though she'd seen something she wished very dearly to forget. Miss Marple cast off her last row, folded her knitting into her bag, and stared out the window at the church steeple rising pale in the moonlight. This isn't about a prayer book, she whispered. Then, with a slow nod, she added, it's about what was inside it. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. The morning after her quiet reflection at the vicarage window, Miss Marple rose early, dressed in a neat pale blue blouse and cardigan, and made her way into the village with the air of someone on an errand no more, pressing than choosing the best gooseberries for a tart. It was, as ever, a calculated disguise. No one took alarm at Miss Marple going about her shopping. It was only when the topic of conversation drifted, softly, inevitably, to recent events that the real work began. She stopped first at Bennett's Grocer's, where Mrs. Peg Riley was inspecting tins of condensed milk, as though she might uncover a plot written on the label. Morning, Jane, Mrs. Riley said, her voice pitched for listening ears. Terrible thing about the prayer book, isn't it? Miss Marple gave a gentle sigh. Yes, yes. I do hope it hasn't caused too much distress. Judith Alderman seemed quite beside herself. Mrs. Riley sniffed. I'd be too, if I were her. Though some say she's more embarrassed than anything else. You heard about her brother, I suppose? I don't believe I have, Miss Marple replied mildly. Well, Mrs. Riley leaned in, lowering her voice as she selected a packet of custard powder. Apparently, he once took a bit of trouble over a communion collection in Cambridge. Never formally charged, mind you, but there were whispers. Perhaps she's sensitive to scandal. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. Though surely no one's suggesting Judith would steal from her own husband. People'll suggest anything if you let 'em, Mrs. Riley muttered. Miss Marple made her purchases, smiled warmly, and continued on her way. At the chemist's, Mr. Rowntree greeted her from behind his gleaming glass counter. He was a small man with a round, pink face and hands that looked like they'd never touched dirt or dough. Always courteous, but always watching. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, polishing his spectacles. "More liniment for Mr. Arnold's shoulder, I expect?" "Thank you, yes," she replied, setting her handbag neatly on the counter. "And perhaps some more menthol lozenges. It's remarkable how the spring dew can catch in the throat." Retrieved both with practiced efficiency. "I imagine this business with the vicar's book has stirred the village a bit," she said casually. Rowntree pursed his lips. "It has. Nasty business, that. Not the sort of thing we expect in St. Aldhelm's." "No," Miss Marple said, tucking the items into her bag. "Not the sort of thing anyone expects. Though I did wonder, has young Miss Cook been in lately?" "She plays the organ, I believe." He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "This morning, actually. Seemed flustered. Wanted camphor for her mother's nerves. Though I dare say the request might have been for her own peace of mind. Miriam's a sensitive sort." Miss Marple nodded. "And musical, too, which can be a burden when people assume artistry comes with imagination." Mr. Rowntree looked intrigued, but knew better than to probe too obviously. Miss Marple made one more stop, this time not at a shop, but at the modest brick cottage belonging to Mrs. Clarissa Cook. She was received stiffly, as always, in a drawing-room that smelled faintly of boiled turnips and lavender polish. Miriam was not home, off to the church to practice, her mother said. "A faithful girl," Miss Marple offered kindly. Clarissa tilted her head. "Faithful, yes, though I sometimes wish she weren't quite so devoted to that vicar." Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting the statement hang in the air. "Has she been upset by recent events?" "Upset?" Clarissa sniffed. "Agitated. You know how it is with girls who fancy themselves part of a higher moral order. All that hymn-playing and scripture-reading makes them feel they're guardians of virtue." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "And yet, she didn't mention seeing anything odd the day of the fete." Clarissa's mouth tightened. "She's been keeping to herself." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Edna Blake," the older woman let out a quiet huff. "That child's barely more than a shadow in a pinny. Jumps if you look at her too quickly. Honestly, Jane, if someone did take the book, it wouldn't surprise me if Edna dropped it in a bucket out of sheer nerves." As Miss Marple stood to leave, she noticed something curious near the sideboard. A small scrap of ribbon, pale lilac in shade, barely visible under the edge of a flower vase. Her eyes lingered on it only a moment. That afternoon, she returned to the vicarage, where Judith was seated in the front room with a stack of hymnals. "I'm reordering the shelves," Judith said briskly, though her eyes were red-rimmed. "Charles says it might help me feel more useful." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "And have you heard anything from Edna?" "She didn't return to the vicarage after her errands," Judith said, worry creasing her brow. "No message, nothing. I fear the girls had some sort of fright." "I fear she may have," Miss Marple replied. She moved to the bookshelf. "May I?" she asked. "Of course." Miss Marple ran a gloved finger along the spines. Psalters, Bibles, hymnals. And there, just behind a bulky concordance, something out of place. She drew it forward. It was not the missing prayer book, but it was a small, folded envelope, yellowed slightly, addressed in looping handwriting to C.M., and sealed with a faded wax crest. "Curious," she murmured, slipping it into her handbag. Later, in her room, Miss Marple opened it delicately. The letter was short, only a few lines, but it was enough. It read, "You said you would speak if it were ever taken. But it has not been destroyed. I could not do that. I beg you, keep your word, or all may fall apart." Miss Marple sat still for a very long time, the paper fluttering faintly in her hand. Not a theft, she thought. A warning. The prayer book had vanished, but not for profit. It had vanished because it contained something, or referenced something, that someone desperately feared might surface. And Edna knew exactly what it was. Chapter 4. First suspects. The arrival of Constable Graves 2 days after the vicarage. Garden party did little to quell the rising tide of rumor. Though not precisely known for his brilliance, Graves was a well-meaning man in his 40s, who took his role with the earnestness of a border collie guarding a gate. Word of his presence spread quickly through St. Aldhelm's, and with it, a new thrill, official investigation. Nothing delighted a village more than the notion that one of their own might be a suspect. Graves had set up a makeshift inquiry station in the side room of the church hall. Barely more than a small table, 2 chairs, and a tepid pot of tea provided by Mrs. Weatherby, who'd taken it upon herself to assist with the proceedings. Miss Marple, of course, did not insert herself into the interviews. She simply passed by at strategic times, knitting in hand, pausing now and then to chat with the occasional parishioner who stepped out looking vaguely affronted or indignant. By midday, the whispers had begun. "It's the girl," murmured Mrs. Havers to Mr. Elkin in the bakery queue. "Edna Blake, the maid. They say she had access to the study and was seen loitering near the lectern the evening before. Judith said she didn't come back after running errands. Someone else," added, "very suspicious. And she's from outside, isn't she?" "Stoke-on-Trent," came the solemn reply. Miss Marple overheard all of this from the bread shelf, her eyes lingering on a cracked-bottomed rye loaf that she didn't really intend to buy. She returned to the vicarage shortly after, where Judith sat at the desk in the front room, fingers trembling slightly, as she held a list of household expenses. "I never should have taken her in," Judith murmured, clearly distressed. "The agency said she was timid, but reliable. I thought a quiet village like ours might do her good. But now—" Miss Marple set her gloves on the desk gently. "Judith, do you truly believe Edna would steal a prayer book?" Judith's mouth tightened. "I don't know. But she's missing. And that looks rather damning, doesn't it?" "It looks," said Miss Marple gently, "like someone very frightened. And frightened people don't always run because they're guilty. Sometimes they run because they've seen something they cannot explain, or something they can." Judith said nothing, but her expression darkened with thought. It was later that afternoon that Miriam Cook stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. She arrived under the pretense of asking after a pattern for lace doilies, but her hands twisted her handbag into a worried knot, and her eyes, usually doe-like and gentle, were wide with distress. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she said quietly as Miss Marple poured tea. "Mother's been difficult, and the police, well, they asked me questions this morning. About Edna, about whether I'd seen her around the church." "Had you?" Miss Marple asked kindly. Miriam hesitated. "I did see her once. A few days before the fete. She was standing in the side vestry with the prayer book in her hands. She looked pale. I asked if she was all right, and she just nodded and slipped out without a word." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you see where she went?" "No, but she left something behind, something folded in a hymnal. I didn't think much of it at the time, a scrap of paper." "And did you read it?" Miriam looked guilty. "Yes. I know I shouldn't have. It said something odd. He promised not to put it in, but he lied. No name, no context." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but her tone remained gentle. And did you tell the constable? Miriam flushed. No. I was afraid it might look like I was making things up, and Mother would have said I was meddling. Miss Marple reached out and patted Miriam's hand. You did right to come to me, dear. But now it's time we both stopped being observers. That evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church. She had secured the key from Reverend Alderman under the pretense of retrieving a misplaced handkerchief, though in truth, she was after something far less sentimental. The church was empty, lit only by the late rays of the sun filtering through, the high stained glass windows, washing the nave in dusty gold and crimson. She walked slowly past the pews, trailing her gloved hand along the edge, her eyes alert. The lectern, once proud and central, now stood slightly askew, its top bare. She moved instead toward the vestry, where she had last seen Edna in her mind's eye, standing, pale and silent, with the prayer book clutched in her hands. It took no more than 10 minutes. Inside a rarely used cabinet of unused offertory cards and tattered Bibles, she found what she was looking for, an envelope tucked inside a disused collection ledger. It was addressed again to C.M., the vicar's initials. Inside, another letter. You said it wouldn't be written, that it wouldn't be made part of the book. But it's there between the Psalms and the Gospel of John, and you know how dangerous that is. If you don't take it out, I will. Even if I must take the whole book. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her brow furrowed. It wasn't just fear that drove Edna. It was betrayal. She turned, thoughtful, and stepped slowly back into the nave. Somewhere between the Word of God and the whispers of St. Aldhelm's, a secret had been tucked into that prayer book, and someone had promised to keep it hidden, someone who had failed. That night, as Miss Marple returned to the vicarage for supper, the village air felt heavier than usual. Not with rain, but with anticipation. Rumor had moved from curiosity to hunger. A resolution was coming. The village wanted a culprit, and all the while, one young girl, alone, scared, was still missing. Miss Marple, seated once again by her guest room window, took up her knitting and looked out at the chapel steeple silhouetted by moonlight. They're all chasing the wrong shadows, she murmured. Then, under her breath, it wasn't Edna they should have been watching. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. Next morning dawned crisp and bright, as if the English weather had decided, without irony, to provide a backdrop of innocence to a village increasingly tangled in suspicion. Birds sang over St. Aldhelm's rooftops, milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, and gossip steeped alongside morning tea in parlours across the parish. But Miss Marple wasn't at her usual spot in the window seat. Instead, she stood in the vicarage study with a sheet of notepaper in her hand. She had requested, rather offhandedly, to see the vicar's sermon drafts from the past month, in case they contained anything about humility worth repeating to the ladies' auxiliary. And the Reverend, puzzled but obliging, had directed her to the filing box by the bureau. What she found was not a sermon, but an envelope similar to the others, this one addressed not to C.M., but to J.A. Judith Alderman. She opened it with slow fingers. Inside was a page of tightly written lines, signed simply with the initial E. You told me to trust you, that he wouldn't let it get printed. But it was there, clear as the morning hymn. He wrote it in. Why would he do that? You said he'd changed, that the shame was over. But he meant for people to see. I think you wanted it that way, too. Miss Marple frowned and reread the letter. Printed? The phrase stood out strangely. The prayer book, as she understood it, had been a personal copy, not mass-produced. But the letter implied something, had been included. Written into the book deliberately, perhaps even inserted between its pages, and it hadn't been done in haste. It had been planned. She folded the letter and placed it in her handbag. When she turned around, she found Judith standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. Jane, Judith said quietly. What are you looking for, really? Miss Marple regarded her with gentle but piercing eyes. The truth, Judith. And perhaps a bit of kindness for a frightened girl. Judith's composure wavered. You think I've been unkind to Edna? I think, said Miss Marple softly, that something was done behind Edna's back. And she believed you were part of it. Judith closed her eyes for a moment, then stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. There was something, she admitted. Charles added a dedication to the prayer book, in his own hand, not to a person, but to an idea. He called it a reckoning. A call to confront what the church had once covered up. Miss Marple sat slowly. I see, she said. And what did he mean by that? Judith hesitated. It was about Edna's uncle. Years ago, he was a curate here. A quiet man. Beloved. By many. But he was accused of something serious, with one of the choir boys. Nothing was ever proven, but the bishop removed him from his post quietly. No charges, just silence. And what happened to him? He drank, Judith said, voice tight. Then he died. Miss Marple's hands remained still in her lap. And Charles, your husband, wrote about it in the prayer book? Yes. As part of a personal reflection. He believed the church should face its own sins. He felt guilty that he had said nothing at the time, even though he'd only just joined the parish then. But Edna, when she saw it, she believed you were dragging her family's name through the mud, Miss Marple finished gently. Judith nodded, tears threatening. She was so angry and heartbroken. She came to me after morning service a week ago, said she wanted the page removed, that it wasn't fair. I promised her I'd ask Charles. But you didn't. No, Judith admitted. I thought Charles would do it quietly, but he didn't. He believed it was time the truth was part of the church's story. And so, Miss Marple said softly, she took the book. Judith stared at her. You really believe it was Edna? I believe she believed she had to, for her uncle, for her family, perhaps even for herself. Later that day, Miss Marple walked to the edge of the village where the last cluster of cottages stood before the road gave way to open heath. She had one particular destination in mind, the home of Mrs. Edith Prentice, a former schoolmistress who now ran a small lodging house that took in, as she said, quiet girls and temporary boarders of the better sort. Edna Blake, Miss Marple, knew, had once lodged here before she was taken in by the vicarage. Mrs. Prentice greeted her with the wary civility she afforded all unannounced callers. She's not here, she said quickly when Miss Marple asked after Edna. I haven't seen her since she left your lot. Miss Marple smiled. I understand. I'm not here to accuse, you know. Mrs. Prentice folded her arms. She's a good girl. Better than most. Timid, yes, but not a liar. And certainly not a thief. I quite agree, said Miss Marple. May I sit? Over tea, the old woman's defenses softened. Edna came by night before last. Late. She was shaking. Said she needed a place to sleep, just for the night. She didn't say why. I gave her the attic room. She left early the next morning. Miss Marple hesitated. Did she leave anything behind? Mrs. Prentice's eyes narrowed. You're not the first to ask that. Constable Graves came poking around yesterday. I told him the same thing. No, she didn't leave anything, but... But? Prompted Miss Marple. She left cleaner, the old woman said slowly. Clearer, like she'd made peace with something. Miss Marple stood, thanking her with a warm hand on the shoulder. Peace, she thought, as she stepped back into the spring air. That wasn't something one found after a theft. It was something one found after a decision. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. The Reverend Alderman greeted her at the door, his face still heavy with worry. I'm beginning to wonder, he said quietly, whether the book matters at all anymore. It does, Miss Marple said, because what was hidden in it tells us who was hurt and who still hopes to heal. She paused, then added, Charles, I need to know exactly what you wrote inside that book. The vicar blinked. It was no more than a personal reflection. But specific, Miss Marple said gently, and meant for someone to find. He hesitated, then nodded. I see now, he said. Perhaps not the way I intended, but yes. It was meant to be seen. Then I believe Edna may be ready to return, Miss Marple said, and in her heart she knew the prayer book was not gone. It was waiting. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. The next morning began with a surprising arrival at the vicarage. Edna Blake. She came not with an air of triumph, nor one of confession, but with the quiet solemnity of someone who had wrestled a private storm and now returned to its eye. Judith Alderman opened the door herself and stared for a long second before saying only, Come in, child. Miss Marple was already seated in the drawing room, teacup in hand, as if she had been expecting the girl all along. Edna looked thinner than she had a week ago. Her dress was rumpled, her eyes shadowed, but there was a firmness to her spine that hadn't been there before. I'm not here to beg, she said, glancing quickly at Judith. I know I can't stay. I just wanted to say, I didn't mean to cause trouble. No one's accusing you, said Judith softly, though her voice betrayed the nervous tremor of withheld questions. Miss Marple set down her cup. Perhaps you didn't cause the trouble, Edna, she said. Perhaps you only prevented it from going unnoticed. The girl's lips parted slightly, as if she might protest. Then, instead, she nodded. I didn't steal it, she said. I just took it away, hid it. I didn't know what else to do. You thought if you removed the book, you'd remove the shame, Miss Marple murmured. But shame has roots, doesn't it? And those roots run deep in villages like ours. Edna blinked fast. He wrote about Uncle Matthew. I saw it, in the back pages. A prayer of forgiveness, he called it. But to me, it felt like an accusation. Miss Marple nodded. Because no one ever said it aloud. No one ever answered it, so silence settled in like fog. Judith reached for the girl's hand. We didn't mean to shame your family. Charles meant it as penance. I know that now, Edna whispered. But when I saw it, I felt like I was being watched by everyone who ever whispered about him. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but pointed. So you took the book. Where is it? Now, my dear. In the chapel, beneath the choir loft, Edna said, wrapped in a towel. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Judith sat back, exhaling slowly. Then we can bring it back. But Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. There's one more thing, Edna. You weren't the only one who knew about that page, were you? The girl hesitated. I don't know. You left a note for Judith, Miss Marple continued, and another, addressed to Charles. But there was someone else who approached you. Someone who warned you not to speak. At that, Edna's expression faltered. It was Mrs. Cook, she said finally. She came to me a few days before the fete, said I should be careful, that if I stirred up old scandals, I'd end up worse than my uncle. Judith gasped. Clarissa. She told me the village had a long memory, Edna continued. Said I should keep quiet if I valued my place here. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did she mention anything else? Say why she was so concerned. Edna's voice lowered. She said people forget that scandal clings not just to the accused, but to anyone who stood near them, even those who sang in the same choir. There was a silence in the room. Miss Marple rose. It seems Mrs. Cook's past may not be quite as distant as she'd prefer. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Cook residence. Clarissa answered the door in a heavy shawl despite the spring sun and looked as though she had slept poorly. Jane, she said stiffly. If this is about Miriam, she's not home. I came to speak with you, actually, said Miss Marple. About the prayer book. Clarissa's lips tightened. Has it been found? Soon, Miss Marple replied, and with it, a note that young Edna claims was left in response to what she read inside. Clarissa folded her arms. She's always been sensitive, that sort of girl, poor breeding, overly emotional. I believe, Miss Marple said softly, that Edna reminded you of someone else, someone who was shamed, and you feared the past would return to cast its shadow. Clarissa's face turned stony. You warned her, Miss Marple continued, because you thought the shame would spread, that the village might remember not just the curate, but the choir he led. The people who worked beside him, trusted him. Clarissa said nothing. Your daughter was in that choir, Miss Marple said gently. Wasn't she? The older woman's chin lifted. She was a child. I know, said Miss Marple, but she was a child you protected. You didn't want her questioned, or dragged through the kind of whispers you once endured. Clarissa's hand trembled slightly on the edge of the door frame. I didn't know, she said after a moment. Not then, not until later, and when I found out, he was already gone. Did you speak to anyone? Who would listen? She said bitterly. Back then, the church kept its face clean and buried its rot beneath the pews. The bishop sent him away. That was all. Miss Marple's voice softened. So when Charles Alderman wrote about it, even in atonement, you feared it would resurface. Not just for the village, but for you. Clarissa looked away. I did what I thought would protect Miriam. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I understand. But fear does not excuse cruelty, Mrs. Cook. Edna needed comfort, not warning. Clarissa closed the door slowly without replying. By evening, the missing prayer book had been quietly returned. Judith found it resting beneath the vicar's study window in a brown paper parcel, with no note. It was intact, the pages untouched. But one sheet had been added, a single handwritten line, tucked between the pages of Psalms. Truth is only dangerous when it hides alone. Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with her shawl around her shoulders and her knitting in her lap. The air was cooling, the sun softening into golden haze. Judith sat beside her. Do you think it's over? She asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Scandal has a long echo in a village like ours, but yes, the worst is past. And Edna, she'll need time, but I dare say she'll stay. Once people see her not as the girl who fled, but the one who returned. Judith looked up at the bell tower, where the light caught the old stone cross. I never imagined something so small, just a line in a book, could unravel such old wounds. It's never the book, Miss Marple said softly. It's what people see when they read it. And the garden, like the village itself, fell into a hush. Chapter 7. Another twist for 2 days, the village of St. Aldhelm's exhaled. With the prayer book returned, the whispers began to shift toward resolution. Judith Alderman reinstated her weekly reading circle. The church resumed its usual rhythm of hymn practice, brass polishing, and mild squabbles over flower arrangements. Even Edna Blake, newly returned to the vicarage in a tentative truce, had begun taking morning walks and offering small, grateful smiles at the parishioners who nodded at her in passing. Miss Marple, too, had turned her attention to more domestic matters, restocking her tea tin, thinning out the roses along her garden wall, and responding to a letter from her niece in Eastbourne. But beneath her calm exterior, Miss Marple remained unsettled. She had learned long ago that villages rarely offered true closure. More often they rearranged appearances like furniture, tidied up the space, but left the cracks beneath the carpet untouched. And then, on the third morning, the calm broke. It began with a knock at her front door. Constable Graves stood on the step, his hat in his hand and his mouth set in a tight line. It was not his usual shuffling presence. Something had changed. "Miss Marple," he said quietly. "We've had an incident. I thought it best you heard before the village got hold of it." She ushered him in with barely a word and poured tea while he remained standing, his fingers twitching at his cap brim. "It's Miriam Cook," he said at last. "She's gone missing." Miss Marple set the teapot down with deliberate care. "Missing?" Her mother reported it this morning. Said she never came home last night. Apparently Miriam had gone to the church after supper. Something about finishing a musical arrangement for next Sunday's service. She never came back. "Has anyone searched the church?" "We've done a sweep of the nave, vestry, the loft. Nothing. The back gate was left ajar. There were boot prints in the dew on the south path leading into the woods, but they vanished near the stream." Miss Marple's eyes clouded with thought. Was anything left behind? Graves hesitated. Her sheet music, still on the piano. And her mother? Panicked, naturally. "But there's more." He lowered his voice. "Clarissa claims she found a note in Miriam's room, torn from a diary. Just said, 'It wasn't only him.'" Miss Marple sat back slowly, a thread of cold settling across her spine. "This," she said quietly, "is no longer about a missing book. It never was." Within the hour, the village was ablaze. The news that Miriam Cook had vanished spread from the vicarage to the bakery to the post office like wildfire. Theories ignited with frightening speed. Some claimed she had run away. "Artistic girls are prone to it," sniffed Mrs. Weatherby. Others whispered about unspoken romances, secret assignations, or punishment for past sins. The return of the prayer book had offered a veneer of calm, but now the storm had broken open once more. Miss Marple walked to the church alone. The sky above was pale and cold, and the wind carried a restless energy. Inside the church, the air was still, but not silent. Somewhere, faintly, she heard the creak of floorboards. She followed the sound toward the choir loft stairs and paused. There, near the steps, lay something small and pale, a lilac ribbon. It matched the one Miss Marple had noticed under Mrs. Cook's flower vase days earlier. She crouched slowly, lifting it between her gloved fingers. A thin stain of dark soil marked the edge, as though it had been trodden on in haste. She didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, she walked back to the nave and sat quietly in the second pew, and waited. She knew that soon someone would come. It was just past 1 o'clock when the church door creaked open and Clarissa Cook stepped inside. She looked older, somehow, not merely from worry, but from the weight of something long buried, now breaking through. Miss Marple did not turn to greet her. "You should sit, Clarissa," she said softly. Clarissa froze mid-step. "Have you found her?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but I believe you know where to look." Clarissa's breath caught. "She left a note," Miss Marple continued. "But not for you. Not really. For herself. For someone who might one day understand." Clarissa sat heavily in the pew behind her. "She wasn't supposed to see it," she whispered. "The writing in the prayer book. She wasn't supposed to know." Miss Marple turned now, her voice still gentle. "But she did." Clarissa's hands clenched around her bag. "I thought it was behind us, that we'd buried it." "She read the passage Charles added," Miss Marple said, "and she asked you questions. She wanted to know what happened to Uncle Matthew, why the village had covered it all up, why I never told her." Miss Marple nodded. She asked, "Too many questions," Clarissa continued. "And when Edna came back, when people started whispering again, Miriam thought it was about her, that the shadow was falling again. She said she'd find out the rest, even if it meant asking the bishop himself." A silence settled between them. "She's not gone far," Clarissa said at last. There's a shelter near the stream, a hollow in the woods. She used to go there as a girl. I think she just needed to feel alone." Miss Marple stood. "Then it's time we brought her back." Later that evening, word spread quietly through the village that Miriam Cook had been found. She was unharmed, cold, shaken, but safe. She had indeed hidden herself in the wooded hollow by the stream, wrapped in an old blanket, clutching a diary in her hands. She had planned, it seemed, not to run, but to wait, to decide whether to speak or remain silent. Miss Marple sat with her that night in the vestry, while Judith brought her tea and Graves took Clarissa gently aside. "You were never to blame," Miss Marple said softly to Miriam. "But it touched me," Miriam whispered. "That shadow. My mother never said, but I could see it, on her face, in the way she hushed things, in the way she looked at Edna like she might reopen the wound." "Silence is a heavy inheritance," Miss Marple replied. "It's passed like heirlooms in families that never speak the truth. But now, perhaps, you've broken it." Miriam said nothing, but her eyes filled with tears. As Miss Marple stepped back out into the night, the village lights flickering gently against the dark, she turned once more to the church. The prayer book had returned, but what it carried had only just begun to be understood. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The next morning, a fragile calm returned to St. Aldhelm's. The birds sang a little softer, and even the village dogs, sensitive creatures in their own way, seemed to bark with less urgency. Miriam Cook had returned to her mother's house under Constable Graves' discreet watch. She had spoken very little since being found, though the fevered tension in her eyes had given way to exhaustion. Miss Marple, seated in the vicarage's conservatory with a pot of rosehip tea, allowed herself a few quiet moments of contemplation. The truth, she knew, was like a buried seed. It did not remain buried forever. Sometimes it needed water, sometimes pressure, and sometimes it simply needed time. But in rare cases, it needed a small, deliberate prod. A test. She glanced out the window at the narrow garden path, winding toward the vicarage's side gate. Clarissa Cook would be arriving soon. Miss Marple had sent the note that morning, politely worded, ever so neutral. "Would you care to stop by this afternoon? I'd appreciate your help identifying a ribbon I came across while clearing the chapel." She made sure the words suggested nothing, but the implications, as always, were another matter. At precisely 2:30, Clarissa Cook appeared, her shawl wrapped more tightly than the day warranted, her mouth set in that narrow, defensive line Miss Marple had seen so often over the years, usually just before. A confession of one sort or another. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said warmly. "I was just in the midst of deciding whether to begin planting the sweet peas along the west fence, but perhaps it's too early." Clarissa gave a distracted nod, her eyes flicking to the small box on the table. Inside, resting atop a linen napkin, lay the lilac ribbon recovered from the church. Miss Marple did not gesture to it immediately. Instead, she poured tea. "I've always found the garden a fine place for clarity," she said. "Something about the combination of earth and labor. People speak more plainly among roses." Clarissa didn't respond. Miss Marple lifted the lid of the box. "I found this, you see, not far from the choir loft, near where Miriam had last been seen. I recognized it, or thought I did." Clarissa's gaze dropped to the ribbon. Her fingers twitched. "It looks like one of Miriam's old things," she said after a moment. "She used to wear them in her hair, years ago." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Funny thing about ribbons. They're never just ribbons, are they? A certain shade can recall a whole season of life. A lilac ribbon might remind a mother of the child she once dressed, once comforted, or once tried to protect." Clarissa's lips pressed together. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone still light but laced with something more piercing. "Tell me, Clarissa, what did you think Miriam would do after she read the writing in the prayer book?" Clarissa's head jerked up. "She told me," Miss Marple continued, "that you never answered her questions, that you simply grew cold, withdrawn, as though silence might do what truth could not." "She didn't understand," Clarissa said, her voice tight. "Did you?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clarissa shook her head, the fight beginning to fade from her shoulders. "I thought I could outrun it. I thought if we never named it, it would fade. But it didn't." "No," she said. "It waited." Miss Marple gently closed the box. "You see, Clarissa, shame cannot be passed off like an unwanted garment, and protection, when done poorly, begins to resemble control. Miriam didn't vanish because of what others did. She vanished because she couldn't bear the silence you gave her." Clarissa's eyes shimmered, but she held herself together with visible effort. "I just didn't want her ruined," she whispered. "It's not just about what happened. It's about the stains that come after. I didn't want them to settle on her." Miss Marple reached across the table and patted her hand. "Then let the stains settle where they belong, and let her speak. Let her decide what to carry." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the church alone. Inside, the air was cool and fragrant with old wood and hymnals. The organ, unused that day, loomed in silence. Miriam was there, seated in the front pew. She didn't start when Miss Marple approached. She only shifted slightly, as though making room. "Clarissa came to tea," Miss Marple said gently. Miriam nodded, her eyes fixed on the carved altar. "She told me more than she ever has." Miss Marple smiled softly. "She's trying. That doesn't erase what came before, but beginnings often start small." They sat for a time in companionable quiet. "You're not angry with her?" Miriam asked suddenly. "I've lived long enough," Miss Marple replied, "to know that anger grows best in the dark. Bring it into the light, and it often becomes something else. Grief, perhaps. Or understanding." Miriam looked down at her folded hands. "I kept the page." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The one from the prayer book. The one about the reckoning." She pulled a folded slip of paper from her pocket and handed it over. Miss Marple read the lines slowly. "Forgive us not only for what we have done, but for what we have allowed to be done in our silence." She returned it gently. Miriam said nothing, but tucked it back into her coat like something sacred. Then she looked up and asked, "Do you think it will go quiet again, Miss Marple?" "The village?" The old woman smiled faintly. "Perhaps. But if it does, it will be an honest quiet, not the kind that smothers." That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat once more by the fire. Her knitting lay untouched beside her. Instead, she took up her diary and, with her usual deliberate script, began writing a new entry. It is strange, the weight a book can carry when the ink inside tells a truth no one wanted said. And yet, when finally spoken, how quickly truth fills the room, like light in a dusty attic. She paused. The prayer book was never lost. Not really. It simply waited to be opened by the right hands. She closed the diary, set it aside, and smiled softly into the glow of the fire. Justice, she had long known, did not always come in the form of a gallows or a courtroom. Sometimes it came in the quiet return of a girl who had once disappeared. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following Sunday was overcast, with low grey clouds stretched across the sky like an unspoken warning. Inside St. Aldhelm's Church, the pews filled with villagers donning their usual coats and Sunday expressions. Upright, subdued, and carefully curated, to imply nothing at all. But under those hats and scarves, something had shifted. The mystery of the missing prayer book and Miriam Cook's brief disappearance had cast a long, unsettling shadow over the village. And now, though the book had returned and the young woman with it, unease lingered like a perfume no one could name. The vicar's voice trembled only slightly during the opening prayers. The congregation, more still than usual, followed along, with the kind of reverence that often comes when people are watching one another more closely than God. Miss Marple sat 3 rows from the front, her gloves folded neatly on her lap, her eyes soft but alert. She had not called a meeting, nor summoned an audience, nor made any pronouncement. She simply waited. It was after the service in the church hall that the conversation began to shift. The kettle steamed, the biscuits were passed, and then, as if by unspoken consent, a small group clustered near the long table under the frosted windows. The Reverend Alderman, Judith, Edna Blake, Clarissa and Miriam Cook, and, unobtrusively, as ever, Miss Marple herself. "Thank you all," Miss Marple said softly, "for sitting with me a moment. I know you'd all rather return to your routines, but there's something I'd like to share if I may." No one objected. If anything, there was a ripple of collective breath held just under the surface. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "The mystery of the prayer book, you see, was never about the loss of a thing. It was about the presence of something much more dangerous, a truth tucked between its pages." Judith stirred, but said nothing. Miss Marple looked to Edna. "You saw it first, didn't you, dear? The added page. Your uncle's name, perhaps not stated directly, but the implication clear." "Enough." Edna's eyes welled, but she nodded. "I thought," she whispered, "that they were going to blame him all over again." "They weren't," Miss Marple said kindly, "but they were finally naming what had never been acknowledged." She turned now to Miriam. "And then you read it, and saw your mother's fear." Miriam nodded. Clarissa looked down, her hands trembling faintly in her lap. "She tried to warn me off," Miriam said softly. "Told me not to get involved. That it would ruin things. But it had already ruined things, hadn't it? Years ago. We just never admitted it." A silence followed, deeper than discomfort, something like grief. Miss Marple let it linger before continuing. "I believe the Reverend wrote those words with the best intentions, but words, especially when long awaited, can act like keys. Once turned, they open more than one door." The Reverend looked troubled. "I thought I was making peace." "You were," said Miss Marple, "but peace doesn't always arrive quietly." She looked now to Clarissa Cook. "You protected your daughter, as any mother would, but in your silence you taught her to fear the past rather than understand it." Clarissa closed her eyes. "I know." Miss Marple's voice softened further. "Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do is allow the truth to pass through us, even if it bruises us on the way." She stood now, and from her handbag withdrew the final piece of the puzzle. A photograph, creased with age, taken from the church archives. It showed a young curate, Edna's Uncle Matthew, in choir robes, flanked by 2 rows of children. One of them was Clarissa Cook, barely 10 years old. Another, standing behind her, slightly apart, was a boy named Anthony Marlowe. "He disappeared from the choir that summer," Miss Marple said quietly. "Sent away to live with an aunt. No explanation, no farewell." The Reverend frowned. "I'd heard the name, but never made the connection." Miss Marple looked around the group. That photograph was tucked inside the church's ledger. Someone had placed it there recently, perhaps in the hope that it might disappear again. Clarissa's breath caught audibly. "I tried," she said, voice cracking. "I tried to remove every trace." "But traces remain," Miss Marple said, "and children remember." Miriam took her mother's hand and held it. "I don't blame you," she whispered. Clarissa's eyes shone, but she did not speak. Miss Marple returned the photograph to her bag. "I say this not to accuse, but to release. Edna did not steal anything. She tried to bury what hurt her. Miriam did not run away. She tried to understand what haunted her. The prayer book became the stage for their griefs to collide, but it was never the crime. She glanced to the Reverend, and Judith. The real healing begins now. For a moment, no one moved. Then Edna stepped forward and turned to Clarissa. "I forgive you," she said, "even if you never asked." Clarissa gave a low, trembling nod, her hand still in Miriam's, and just like that the moment passed, not with applause, not with pronouncement, but with a silence that no longer weighed down. It lifted. That evening, Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage, her shawl wrapped loosely about her shoulders, the wind brushing soft against the hedgerows. There would be no arrests, no headlines, no neat ending, but she had never needed any of those. For Miss Marple, the true resolution was this: that the village, for all its secrets, had chosen to look inward rather than away. And perhaps, just perhaps, the prayer book would return to its place, not as a symbol of shame, but of truth endured. At her gate, she paused to glance once more at the spire of St. Aldhelm's rising into the dusk. "People," she murmured, "are so very like churches, beautiful and solemn, and filled with quiet cracks only the brave ever mend." And with that, she stepped inside, set the kettle on, and resumed her knitting, as though she'd never been away from it at all. Chapter 10. Aftermath spring deepened over St. Aldhelm's. In the days that followed, as if the earth itself had been holding its breath and now exhaled in bloom. The hedgerows thickened with green, the tulips along the churchyard wall opened wide, and the market stalls once again overflowed with rhubarb and early lettuce. From the outside, it would have appeared nothing had changed. And yet, beneath the surface of its stone walls and polite routines, the village had shifted. The Reverend Charles Alderman resumed his Sunday sermons with new gravity. The controversial passage in his prayer book, once scribbled in the back with hesitant conviction, was now read aloud during a special evening service, framed not as judgment, but as confession. The congregation had sat stiller than usual that night, some with bowed heads, others simply listening. A few left early, but most stayed. Miriam Cook returned to the organ loft the following week. She played with her usual precision, though those close enough could see her hands trembled slightly at first. Her mother, Clarissa, sat in the second pew, not at the edge as before, but centered, her eyes lifted rather than cast down. She did not look at her neighbors, nor did she shrink from them. Edna Blake remained at the vicarage. Judith insisted on it, and the girl, though hesitant, began to walk taller. She attended evensong again, now with a plain gold cross at her neck, one Judith had found in a drawer and pressed into her hand, without comment. Constable Graves returned to more ordinary duties, relieved that the case had not ended with sirens or charges, but still not quite sure how it had unraveled at all. Miss Marple had thanked him, of course. She always did. And the prayer book, it was restored to the lectern, just as before. But now it bore a small inscription on the inside cover, added in the Reverend's hand, "May what was once hidden bring light. May silence teach us to listen. May truth, though quiet, be spoken." A few noticed the change. Most did not. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Miss Marple found herself seated in her front room, finishing the heel of a sock and sipping elderflower cordial. Her niece had written from Eastbourne about an upcoming wedding, and there was some mention of a nephew who had taken up philosophy, dreadfully tedious. She smiled faintly at the letter, folded it neatly, and placed it in her writing desk. A knock came at the door. She opened it to find Edna. "I brought you this," the girl said, holding out a small bundle, neatly wrapped in brown paper and string. Inside was a plain cloth handkerchief, newly stitched at the edge with a lilac flower. I thought, well, after everything, you were the only one who believed I hadn't done something wrong. Miss Marple's face warmed. Thank you, dear. But I didn't believe it. I knew it. People are rarely wicked. They are frightened, foolish, hopeful, ashamed, but not wicked. Edna looked down. I still feel like I lost something. Miss, Marple nodded. You did. Innocence, perhaps, or trust in the quietness of things. But you also found something else, strength, and that tends to last longer. The girl smiled, awkward but sincere, and excused herself politely. Miss Marple returned to her chair. That evening, as dusk settled over the lane and the last of the blackbirds sang, Miss Marple prepared a simple supper and allowed her mind to wander back over the case, the threads that had twisted themselves so tightly, a girl's shame, a mother's silence, a page of handwriting tucked into holy pages. She reflected, as she often did, not on the crime, but on the people. It struck her, not for the first time, how little of what happened in St. Aldhelm's had been about malice. Even the act that set it all in motion, the writing in the prayer book, had been born of conscience. The harm had come not from wrongdoing, but from how it had been hidden. People believed that concealment was protection, that silence was mercy. But as Miss Marple knew too well, what we refuse to name never disappears. It waits. And then, when least expected, it rises in some poor girl's trembling hands, or in a ribbon left underfoot. She rose, drew the curtains, and set the kettle on for one last cup of tea. In the corner of her shelf, the week's newspaper sat folded. Its headline read, "No charges in prayer book mystery. Vicar praised for honesty." There was a picture of Charles Alderman, eyes a little wearier, smile a little sadder, and Miss Marple, settling into her chair once more, reached for her diary and wrote, "The mystery was not why the prayer book went missing. The mystery was why it took so long for someone to be brave enough to see what had always been there. Human nature is not so hard to understand, if one remembers that most people are simply trying to live with the things they cannot say aloud." She paused, dotted the last period, and closed the book. Outside, the bells of St. Aldhelm's chimed the hour, and in the cottage with its pink roses and quiet windows, Miss Marple poured her tea and began once more to knit.